Welcome to our snowy day makeup of our discussion of global strategies. Here's what we're going to be talking about. You're going to see I organize this lecture a little bit differently than the textbook presents it because I try to stick with that format of why people do it, how they do it, and then how it goes badly. I normally like to begin the in-class discussion by seeing how well you know the answers to some, if you call it global business trivia. So pause the video for just a second and without Googling it, look up or take your guess at the answers to these questions, and then I'll dive into answering them for you when you restart the video. Okay, stop it and think about the answers. Well, welcome back. What country is Nestle headquartered in? It's actually headquartered in Switzerland. About Coca-Cola in North America, the numbers vary from year to year, as you would expect. But a good average answer to that is about 75%. About 75% of Coca-Cola sales come from outside of North America. So if you think of Coca-Cola as this incredible U.S. company, then you're surprised at how much is outside of the United States. Okay, going back to my beloved aviation industry, Boeing has orders for about 1,500 787s. We talked about that, or we will talk about that a little bit more in the discussion of problems with alliances. So, how many airplanes have U.S. airlines ordered? The answer is only about 10% of that number, a little over 10%. So you can see for Boeing, that is an incredibly global company. And in terms of a balance of trade, they're one of the huge exporters for the United States. Last one, not a product that I care for, but I know many of you do, and that's beer. And so InBev bought Anheuser-Busch and then later SAB Miller. Where's InBev headquartered? It's actually headquartered in Europe. I think it's the Netherlands, to be exact, Netherlands or Denmark. I forgot to check. But what's interesting is InBev is a Brazilian company. So you have a Brazilian company that decided to headquarter in Europe for a variety of reasons, who then bought American brewing giant Anheuser-Busch. You just can't hardly get a better example of a global business than that. So let's talk about why global has grown so much. And this is one of those things where your age either benefits you or doesn't. And the reason I say that is because you really don't know a world that isn't global. I do, because the first part of my life was not nearly in the global economy. And I've got some charts later on that are going to really, I think, surprise you with just how much global trade has grown. So why is that? Well, I'll call it the spread of capitalism. You could also say it's an opening of markets. When I was a young person, there were two distinct spheres of trade. There was the free market, if you will, which was U.S., Western Europe, and lots of other countries, but there were the people in the Soviet sphere of influence that they only traded with the Soviet Union. And I pejoratively would say that's because none of their goods were very good. And then you had this third entity that was completely inward focused, and that was called China. Well, what's changed? We now have more of a reliance on open market systems where countries are trading a lot more. You also combine that with decreasing transportation costs. I don't have any statistics to quote this to you, but this idea of shipping things as cheaply as you can across oceans is a relatively new comparison. Also, decreasing communication costs. Let me illustrate this for you with a personal example. We lived in Japan on 3 different occasions. We moved there for the first time in 1990, and we left the last time in 2005. The first 2 times we were stationed up in a place on the northern part of the main island called Misawa. On that first tour in the early 1990s, it cost on sale about $1 a minute to call from Japan to the United States. When it wasn't on sale, it was about $1.25 a minute. It was much more expensive to call direct from the United States to Japan. So literally, I let my wife have 1 phone call a month of about an hour to call her mom, and that was really the person she called. I literally did not call my family because it was just so expensive. I made cassette tapes. Well, 10 years later, we went back to that same place that we paid $1.25 a minute. And guess what? Long distance costs were 10 cents a minute, if you can believe that. Well, from that time in the early 2000s, from Misawa, Japan, we moved to Clovis, New Mexico at Cannon Air Force Base. A lot of my wife's family lives in New Mexico. And again, you don't relate to this because you've only seen cell phones used, but long distance versus local calls were a big differentiator. And so it cost, believe it or not, to call from Clovis, New Mexico, which is in eastern New Mexico, to where my wife's family was, in Albuquerque and in Roswell and in Alamogordo, 10 cents a minute, the same exact price it cost to call from Misawa, Japan. Well, from Clovis, New Mexico, we went back to Japan, this time to Tokyo, and guess what? It cost 4.5 cents a minute to call long distance. And so it was actually cheaper to call from Japan to my wife's family in New Mexico than it was to call from inside New Mexico to my wife's family. So you see the dramatic reduction of costs. And it just so happens we have a niece that just got married to an Air Force guy, and they just moved to southern Japan. And I just am blown away as we do video chats with her over Wi-Fi, which obviously cost nothing. And so what you see is that the cost of shipping goods around, and very importantly, the cost of communicating worldwide, have essentially dropped. Communications dropped to zero. Shipping is cheaper than it ever has been. So it's taken out that cost of transaction, and that allows the world to become far more global in its trade. Why do people go global? Well, you see the numbers for the chart on the right. If you're going to focus on just the USA or North America, or even all of the Americas, you're cutting yourself off from a lot of the world's business. Now, we talk a lot about globalism, and I want you to keep in mind, and the textbook does a nice job of discussing it, that in many cases, it's regionalism, where companies trade within countries that are close to them, often geographically, but also socially and culturally. I've lived in Europe and I've lived in Asia numerous times. There is no comparison to the cultural differences between the U.S. and Europe and the U.S. and Asia. Asia is a much, much bigger cultural difference than is, well, certainly Western Europe. And so you could see where companies might choose to operate in the Americas or North America and Western Europe as opposed to going into Asia, because they're going to have a lot easier time making that jump. So regionalism is very much a part of what globalism constitutes. These are some numbers to just show you how much the world has gone global. Here's the United States export of goods and services. And very importantly, this includes the export of services, about $2.5 trillion a year. Here, this graphic, and I know it's impossible to read, so I want you to just get the effect of this. This is the export of China. Now, notice that the U.S. bar is much shorter because this particular data set does not include the export of services. If you put the services in there, we would be neck and neck with China probably being a little bit higher. And then you see everybody else falls off. Germany, Japan is a major exporter. Netherlands, can't explain that one. That just must be the fact that they have a shipping port there and something to do with the EU. Here's U.S. imports from China. What I want you to see is 10 years before you were born, it was essentially zero. And today, you see that they are the world's largest exporter, and their trade with us mirrors their trade with the rest of the world. In other words, it was essentially zero back in the 1980s across the board. So why do companies go global? Well, you see these are some of the specifics, but the big things are people want to go for a bigger market. They think that they can, through that bigger market, they can get economies of scale and they can learn, and location advantages. Sometimes that's having to do with the fact that you become viewed as a home country or a home company. Sometimes it has to do with you're just capitalizing on cheaper labor. So if you want to separate them, this thing is I get to sell more. These are I get to sell it cheaper. This one may be I get to sell a wider variety of products. And then you see that in some very iconic brands. So here's a story about Harley Davidson. from the Wall Street Journal. I'm having trouble moving my box a little bit. Harley Davidson is doing pretty well overseas. Now, this article is a couple of years old, 2017. And this talks about how they are trying to grow their markets in Asia largely through an export strategy. So they're trying to build them in the United States and export them. Now, if you Google Harley Davidson today, you're going to see that strategy didn't work out quite as well as they thought, because part of the strategy was they were building smaller motorcycles to try to appeal to a younger set. And that's not working out too well for them. The next video, we'll start to get into some more of the details of how companies go global.